Every old-timey woodworker needs a good workbench. You can't just make your projects on the shop floor. I mean, what are we, animals? I suppose you could use a couple of sawhorses, which may eat and poop less than regular horses, but they lack many of the features that make a good workbench so useful. And while it's pretty hard to make your own horse, I'm fixing to show you how easy it can be to make your own high-quality, feature-packed woodworking bench. This time on the Old-Timey Workshop. It seems like wherever I go these days, everyone's talking about the Roubo workbench. It's this trend that's taken the world by storm, kind of like skinny jeans. But really, it's not a new concept. In fact, the Roubo workbench design is about 300 years old. Andre Roubo was the old-timeyest of old-timey woodworkers. Back in the 1700s, when everybody on this side of the pond was fighting over taxes on tea, Roubo was literally writing the book on woodworking. His 5-volume masterpiece was titled The Art of the Joiner, and it told you everything you wanted to know about the craft, as long as you could read 18th century French. But don't worry about it, it's full of pictures. There's one picture in particular, a meticulously detailed woodcut with a dramatic title, Plate 11, that has captured the minds of modern woodworkers looking to add some old-timiness to their workshops. You have to get past the fact that Roubo seemed to be running some kind of sweatshop packed full of workbenches and what looked like little children, or Oompa Loompas. Regardless, the lower half of the plate illustrates a big, beefy beauty. A bench that looks like you could park a car on it. Which was a good thing because I bet garages in Roubo's day were pretty tiny. But if you stare at the plate long enough, you'll see it's not all about the heft of his workbench. It was loaded with all sorts of features that modern old-timey woodworkers have rediscovered and we are going to reimagine. Well, first things first. How do you make a workbench if you don't already have a workbench? I'm so glad you asked. You could use a saw bench like the one we built in our last episode. Or better yet, you could use 2 saw benches. Or you could use a couple of sawhorses, or the kitchen table, or the roof of the wife's minivan. Anything that is reasonably sturdy and stable. Make the top of your bench first, then you can attach your vices and use them to hold the work so you can do the joinery on the bottom half. That's a good tip right there. So what size should a workbench be? Well, my 18th century French is a little rusty, but let's see what Roubo had to say about it. The workbench is the first and most necessary of all woodworking tools. Seems Roubo agrees with me. It's made up of a top, 4 legs, 4 rails, and the bottom. The top is made from a sturdy plank or table about 5 inches to 6 inches thick by 20 inches to 25 inches wide. Its length varies 6 feet to 12 feet, but the most common length is 9 feet. Well, here's where I'm going to have to disagree with the old fella. You see, we don't all have giant French shops where we can sit and eat our flaky pastries on 12-foot workbenches. Many of today's commercially made workbenches are only 5 or 6 feet long because they're better suited to the garage-sized shop. I'm making mine 5 feet long, 22 inches wide, and 34 inches high. The length and the width are just the first numbers that popped into my head, but the height is based upon some complex mathematical formulas, a little bit of calculus, some geometry, a dash of physics, and a pinch of good old what works best for me. The idea is to be a comfortable height for planing over long periods of time. Some people say to just let your arm dangle at your side and measure the distance from the floor to your middle knuckle. Others say to measure from the floor to the crease in your wrist. I say just go into your kitchen table, pile some boards up on top, and get out your favorite hand plane. Experiment with different heights of a stack of boards until you figure out what's most comfortable for you.
If I know anything about old-timey woodworkers, it's that they would have loved the new StumpyNubs.com. This website has everything from new episodes of all the popular Stumpy Nubs shows, video tips, tricks and reviews, project plans, and Stumpy's side-splitting blog. Sign up for the newsletter and don't miss a thing.
So, now that we have our basic dimensions, it's time to talk wood. Let's see what old Ruby had to say about it. This table, I think he means bench, is made out of elm, or beechwood, but most commonly from the latter, which is very stout. I'm sure elm or beechwood is very stout, and I'd love to make my bench of it, but I'd also like to have a few bucks left over to make some projects on the bench when it's done. I'm pretty sure that the old-timey woodworker wouldn't have had any problem using some inexpensive alternatives. Southern yellow pine, Douglas fir, or some of the other dense varieties that are found in the home improvement store can make a great woodworking bench. They might not have had Home Depot in the old-timey days, but old-timey woodworkers did know how to use the materials that they had on hand. And I just happened to have on hand some very old, dry construction lumber, just begging to be turned into a workbench. And who am I to deny a 2x6 its destiny? If you're going to be making your bench entirely with hand tools, the 2x6 is your friend. Edge plane them down a little bit and you have nice 5 1/4 inch wide stock without having to do a bunch of hand ripping. But beware, my old-timey friend, the 2x6 is often the knottiest, wettest stock in the box store. So you can either pick through piles of boards and find some good ones, then let them air dry in your shop for a few weeks, or go with 2x10s or 2x12s, which are often much drier and have fewer large knots. You just have to rip them down to width. I like to think that Roubo would have killed to have a stack of 2x6s to make his bench out of. Remember, this was the era of the guillotine. They were cutting people's heads off over cake. If they would have known how much joinery they could save by using 2x6s, Marie Antoinette would have been a foot shorter a lot sooner. So, we begin with the bench top. According to Roubo, it must be pierced with many holes into which holdfasts can be placed. These holes must be pierced into the top of the bench perpendicularly. Clearly, Roubo's bench isn't just a slab of wood. Well, actually, it is a slab of wood, but it's got more holes in it than a plot in a Victor Hugo novel. Besides holdfast holes, he goes on to describe a large mortise in the top for plane stops. There's mortises for the legs. There's going to be some dog holes in ours. Roubo would have needed an army of Oompa Loompas to chop all those mortises. But with some careful planning, we can avoid all that work. I've got 14 plain 2x6s cut to 5 feet long. So let's lay out our holes. Roubo's holdfast holes zigzagged across the bench, and I'm sure that worked out just great for him. But I'm going to lay mine out in 2 long lines running parallel to the edge of the bench. I've found that unless you have really long holdfasts, a 5-inch thick bench top is a little much. You see, the shaft has to protrude at least a couple of inches through the hole and beneath the bench if you're going to get a good grip. So if you want to maximize how thick of an object you can fasten down on the top of your bench, 3 inches is a pretty good thickness. By running my holes in straight lines, I can just rip 2 of my 2x6s down to 3 inches thick while keeping the rest of my bench nice and bulky. Boring these holes are no fun, let me tell you. A lot of old-timey woodworkers would have just bored a few holes, and then later on when they were working, if they decided they wanted another holdfast somewhere, they'd just bore another hole. But if I do that, eventually my bench is just going to look like Swiss cheese. And since this is a French design, we'd have a whole international incident on our hands. It's better to lay them all out nice and neat now and suck it up and spend 6 or 7 hours just drilling. Roubo's bench didn't have bench dogs. Now that I think about it, I don't remember seeing dogs of any kind in the shop. I don't know what he has against dogs, but many old-timey woodworking benches are loaded with them, and for good reason. They make great plane stops, and nothing stays put like a board pinched between a vise and a dog. I like my bench dogs to be close to the front edge of the bench because that's the most comfortable place to do your planing. In fact, I'm putting a row of bench dog holes on the front and back edges of my bench so I can work from either side. A lot of people use round bench dogs because it's a lot easier to put a round hole in a bench top than a square one. And it's also pretty handy to be able to use your dog holes for your holdfasts. But I prefer square dogs because they just seem to grip the edges of the boards better. And since we're laminating our top together, we don't have to chop mortises anyway. We just cut out our dog holes before we glue our bench top up. Plus, square holes make your bench look more professional. People who see it will think you actually know what you're doing. One of the most unique features of Roubo's bench design is the way he attaches the legs to the top. He kind of uses a double mortise and tenon, but the outer tenon is really more of a sliding dovetail. We can only guess what his reasons were. Some people say that it was just easier than cutting a true double mortise and tenon joint. Evidently, Roubo didn't want to have to chop 2 tenons for each leg. Of course, if he was laminating his bench top together like we are, he wouldn't have to chop mortises anyway. Now, I've been gluing some of these layers up as I work, but when it comes time to tie it all together, I'm going to use some threaded rod for super strength. I prepared for it by pre-drilling 4 holes into each layer before I put them together. Just make sure you drill your holes a little bit oversized. It's murder trying to pound a threaded rod through 22-ish inches of even slightly misaligned holes. Now that we've got our bench top done, it's time to start talking about vices. I like to eat cupcakes and drink cold ones. but my favorite kind of vices are the ones you use to hold your workpieces. The benches in Plate 11 actually didn't have vices. His workers were forced to rely on holdfasts and bench hooks to secure their work, and it's believed that they talked about Roubo behind his back with nasty French swear words because of it. Evidently, he got the point, because if you look closely at the image, on the wall in the background hangs a portable double screw, which could be attached to the bench top for dovetailing. And in the lower illustration, we see a tail vise, which would have been attached directly to one of the legs on the bench. I really like tail vices, because you can really torque on these babies. And they give you a little more depth between the top of the bench and the screw for dovetailing some small boards. It's the true old-timey woodworker's vice, and you can still order them from some companies nowadays. But I found this beautiful old beauty at an antique fair this past summer, and I'm going to mount it on one side of my bench like a true old-timey woodworker. But cast iron vices have been around for a long time too. In fact, over the past 150 years, this has become the most popular of woodworking vices. But choose carefully. Picking out a vice is like choosing a friend. You spend a lot of time together, and you're likely to give it regular beatings. A good vice will last a lifetime, but a cheap one might steal your girlfriend and totally ruin your senior prom. I picked this one up from Rockwood because it's really heavy duty like the old-timey vices, but it also has a modern feature, a quick release. If you've ever had to crank a 10 or 12-inch vise closed, you'll appreciate a quick release, let me tell you. This will mount underneath one of the front edges of the bench top, and I guarantee it will outlast 4 or 5 benches, especially the way I make them. Roubo's workbench didn't have an end vise. In fact, I'm not sure any benches did in his day. But it wasn't long before old-timey woodworkers figured out how handy it is to have some sort of vise on the end of your bench. There are different types of them out there, from wagon vices to tail vices. But those types create a no-pound zone on the corner of your bench. I want to be able to pound anywhere, anytime I want, no matter what my vise says. So I went and picked up a matching tail vise. This one's high quality too, and together they weigh like 1,000 pounds, which really helps add some more heft to my bench. Careful you don't pinch yourself with that quick release when you're installing the vise. Now that we have our vices mounted, we can use them for cutting the joinery on the bottom half of our bench. Of course, we've dramatically reduced the amount of joinery that we have to do by layering our legs just like we did the top. The double tenon on the top of the legs are no problem. All we have to do is make our center layer shorter, and we automatically have 2 tenons on the top. Then all we have to do is bevel the sides of the front tenon into that sliding dovetail shape. Most of the strength in these legs comes from the way they attach to the top. So I have no problem skipping the chopping of the mortises and doing some layering just like we've done on the rest of the bench. This is going to be plenty sturdy. But I'm going to use another old-timey woodworker technique and secure them with cut nails. You can still buy cut nails from specialty suppliers. In fact, many hardware stores and home centers still sell them in a hardened variety, which are used for concrete. These will work just fine for situations like this. But the most important thing to remember when you're using cut nails is if they're large, you have to pre-drill a pilot hole and make sure you orient them with the grain. Otherwise, you're just going to be driving a big wedge into the end of your board. And guess what's going to happen? I don't know. There's just something about building your own tools. Just feels right. In our next episode, we'll wrap up some of the details, we'll build a tool cabinet for underneath, and we'll talk about some of the features that a workbench like this has to offer and how to get the most out of them. Until then, sit back and have yourself a cold one. You've earned it, my friend.